Well, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to speak at Martin Luther King Day for my hometown. Certainly glad to be here. I'm Sam Ford. Currently, I live in Washington, D.C., and Reverend Barker asked me to share some of my thoughts about Martin Luther King, civil rights, as basically there's an observation there of Martin Luther King Day. Now, I grew up in Independence on South 19th Street, and I was about 14 years old watching television one night, and the announcer said, "We interrupt this program for a special news announcement. Martin Luther King is dead." That's exactly how they say it. I'll never forget. And at that point, uh, startling. I mean, there was no information other than that. Martin Luther King is dead. And so they went back to regular programming, and then before long, they were back again. And President Johnson was on the television with Mrs. Johnson. And he was saying that he had heard this had happened, that he and Mrs. Johnson were going to go out, but now they thought they were not going to go out. They were going to stay home. And what happened in Washington, and I understand 114 cities in all, was that there were riots. In fact, here in Washington, I understand that Martin Luther King had his headquarters at 14th and U Streets Northwest. And so a lot of people went there to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference headquarters to follow the news, to find out what had happened. And once they found out that Martin Luther King, in fact, had been killed, then the riot started right there. And it exploded. 14th Street went up in flames, not just 14th Street, but a number of areas here in Washington and cities around the country. So it was a sad time. And some of the students at Independence Junior High, where I was, a ninth grader at the time, asked Mr. Chase, the principal, if they could have a march. And he said no. And a number of students, and I wish I could say I was one of them, but I wasn't one of them, but a number of students decided to have a march anyway. And they started a march at Independence High School, and they marched to the park. And I think they had a few speeches and things like that. And I'm not sure if it was the police chief, but some official of Independence was there, and he basically praised the students for having done that because he said he thought it was important. Now, how do I know all of this? Because Sheila Bush, the late Sheila Bush, as it turns out now, but she did go, and then she was the one that informed me later about everything that had happened. So it had an impact all across the country, and the impact in Independence was that students defied Mr. Chase, the principal, at least some of the students, and had a march despite that. And of course, for a young person growing up in Kansas, is there racism? Yeah, there's racism, but sometimes it's not in your face like it would be in some of these places where we would see police dogs and fire hoses. And quite frankly, I was afraid to go to the South. I mean, it was like, this is why go down there and deal with that kind of stuff. I think the furthest south I'd been was like Muskogee, Oklahoma, and really didn't want to go any further south than that. But eventually, I became a news reporter, and I was working for CBS in New York, and they asked me if I wanted to go to Atlanta because they had an office there, and I'd never been south. And I said, well, I'll go down there and take a look. So I flew to Atlanta, and I remember I was driving down Briarcliff Road, which is where the CBS News Bureau was, and I got there and made the turn and looked, and it was, have you seen Gone with the Wind, where they have these plantation houses with the long columns? Well, I guess in Atlanta television stations, that's what they like to do. So I turned and looked, and I was like, my God, they've sent me to the plantation. But I went on to CBS. They were located in the basement of the WAGA TV station there in Atlanta. And one of the things that happened was I actually got to experience the civil rights movement, let's say years and years later. Because, for example, in 1982, they wanted to reenact basically this civil rights march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. This was a march that Martin Luther King did back in the 60s. And they wanted to reenact that basically to lobby Congress to renew the Voting Rights Act, which the Congress had passed, as you recall, in 1965. So I covered that for CBS. We went to a number of these towns, and you saw people that basically, in some cases, hadn't seen each other since the original march. And it was kind of a reunion time. And we saw people like Hosea Williams, so kind of a rough guy, but I guess the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had to have some rough people too. I thought Reverend in front of the name, the way he talked, but what can you say? I said, I guess they had to have all types there in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And you would see people like Andrew Young. You would see Joseph Lowry, who was the head of the SCLC, whose wife is from Wichita, by the way. Anyway, so you saw all these people. I got to know these people. It was really interesting, and I got a sense of the civil rights movement, just covering it, meeting Mrs. Coretta King, Martin Luther King's wife. I interviewed her a number of times, and it was a dynamic movement. People talked about it. It changed things not just for people in the South, but for people all over the United States. And then I guess it was about 1980, and I was living in Atlanta, and I saw that Rosa Parks, the anniversary of her refusing to give up her seat on the bus was coming up. I think it was like the 25th anniversary. Anyway, I told CBS, I said, I would like to go and do an interview with Mrs. Parks about this anniversary. And they said, sure, going up to Detroit. So, I decided, I'd like to see this person, Mrs. Rosa Parks. You saw the pictures of her being fingerprinted by the white police officer after she refused to give up her seat. News reports at the time said that Mrs. Parks, who was a seamstress, was just getting off work. She was tired and she didn't want to give up her seat. And so, I had all these ideas. So I went to Detroit. We managed to catch her, taking the bus home from her office. At that time, she was working in the office of Congressman John Conyers, who was the congressman from Detroit. And we caught her as she left his office, got on the bus. We rode on the bus with her to her apartment. And we proceeded to set up to do an interview with her. One of the funniest things, Rosa Parks is a shy person. If you've heard of shy person, Rosa Parks was, and I'm thinking, how in the world could this woman have been the one that stood up and created essentially the civil rights movement? But that's what happens sometimes, some people just, they're shy, but there's only so much they're going to take. Well, anyway, trying to interview Miss Parks was difficult because, sometimes there'd be 5 seconds between words, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness. But anyway, listening to her story, basically, this is how it happened. She was actually the secretary of the NAACP there in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. And, they were tired of this situation where, the black people had to sit in the back of the bus. Well, there's this one bus driver. She told me that 12 years earlier, this bus driver had gone off and left her because he didn't like the way she entered the bus. Here's the story. Some of the bus drivers, you could just pay your money in the front of the bus and go on back and sit down. But there were some of them, like this guy, you had to pay your money in the front of the bus, exit the bus, and then go in the back door of the bus and sit down. She said that 12 years earlier, she had gone in, put her money in the front and went back and sat down. And this driver says, get off this bus and come in the back door. So Ms. Parks said she got up, walked back to the front, went out the front door to go to the back. He closed the door, drove off and left her. So she hadn't liked this man for 12 years. And so here comes another situation where the law was, quote, separate but equal. Separate but equal. Now, to Mrs. Parks, if they're going to put the blacks in the back half of the bus, that meant that the back half of the bus belonged to black people. and the white half of the bus belonged to white people, if it's separate but equal. So she's sitting in the front row of the black half of the bus. Well, there were some drivers, it wasn't a big problem. If the white half of the bus filled up, the white people would stand in the white half of the bus and the black people would stand in the black part of the bus, and that's just how it worked. But there were some of these drivers that they didn't want any white people standing if black people were sitting. And so the driver said, "I'm declaring that a white row, y'all clear out." And Miss Parks said, "I'm in my part of the bus. I'm not going to clear out. I'm not getting up." And the driver told her she had to get up. And she said to the driver, "Why do you all treat us this way?" And the driver said, "Look, I don't know, but you're supposed to get up, and I'm going to call the police." And so the bus stayed there until the police came. And Miss Parks said that the police officer told her she had to get up. And she asked him, "Why do you all push us around?" He says, "Well, I don't know, but you're under arrest." And so at that point, she was taken down to the police station. You might see that famous picture of her while she is being fingerprinted. One of the things she said was that the officer was so nervous that was fingerprinting her, she had to help him do it because I guess there were cameras there taking pictures of this situation. Anyway, she was well known in the area. Again, the secretary of the NAACP. She was a member of the AME church there in Montgomery. And when people heard about this good woman, 42 years old at the time, seamstress at the department store downtown, that she had been treated this way, they rallied around her. And they decided, particularly, they had meetings in the church called the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, in the church of Martin Luther King, a young minister about 25 years old. And they organized and decided that they would stop riding the buses because of the discrimination. And it worked. I mean, it's amazing that it took a while. Believe me, if you read the history of it, it took over a year. And really, they stopped basically when the Supreme Court ruled against them. But nevertheless, black people would not be on these buses for a year, and it cost money. And at that point, it broke the back of segregation, at least in that city, with that issue. And that, of course, was, it started in 1955, and it continued until 1956. And, the impact was, again, monumental. And I'm thinking, this lady here, this shy person, was the one who did this. But you know something? Mrs. Parks was a very impressive person. When you saw the determination, and I've interviewed a number of famous people, I've never been interested in saying to them what I said to Miss Parks that day. And I said, "Miss Parks, would you have dinner with me tonight?" And Miss Parks said, "Can I bring my nephew?" I said, "Of course." And so me and Mrs. Parks and my TV crew, and I had a cousin in Detroit, he joined us. We sat and we talked around the table, and we had a wonderful evening. Miss Parks, once you get away from the TV cameras, is a very nice lady. She reminds you of your aunt. Just a sweet lady. And we talked about everything. And I told her about, my covering some Klan marches in Alabama. She was really fascinated by that. But that is one of the memorable evenings of my life. And I've always, loved Ms. Rosa Parks. And then subsequently, years later, I heard Mrs. Parks was in Washington and in our building at Channel 7. So immediately, of course, I went to the room. There was Mrs. Parks. I leaned down and said, "Miss Parks, you may remember me. I interviewed you in Detroit." She said, "Yeah." I said, "You're the one that covered the Klan." I said, "Yeah, you're right." That was the story we talked about that night. So we had a good time talking about it then. And then, of course, years and years later, Mrs. Parks died. And it was one of those interesting things where the NAACP, I think, decided to, kind of share her with America, if you will. They had 2 days. She lay in repose, I think is the word they put it, but she was in the rotunda of the Capitol, and people could walk by, and people walked by the whole time. I mean, it was the first time I think they had done this for a non-member of Congress or a president, and she lay in repose, and then they had a service for her at Metropolitan AME Church, which is the as you say the headquarters church for the AME denomination, and the DC Police Honor Guard marched with the casket. They marched to the church. They took the casket out of the hearse. And at that point, there was a man next to me. And he wasn't black. I think maybe he was Hispanic. But in any event, he started yelling, "Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Rosa." And everybody picked it up, including me. Thank you, Rosa. Because she made such an impact. And again, it's often the shy person, shy but determined person, who has the biggest impact. And that, again, was one of the great experiences of my tenure as a news reporter, was meeting Mrs. Rosa Parks. Well, I hope you all have a good Martin Luther King Day. I'm going to be busy here. We're actually doing a Martin Luther King special at my station on Martin Luther King Day. See you later.